numbers?
Yeah, just hold it down.
Yeah.
Mark?
So let's start with your family and childhood. Can you tell me where you grew up?
I grew up in New York City, actually in the real part of the city, Manhattan. I grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in the housing projects on Delancey Street. And it was with my mother, my older brother, and my younger sister, and myself in a small apartment. I was born in 1958, and we lived our whole life in this area up until my mother died, when she died in 1983. And so it was at the beginning of, it was like in the heart of the civil rights era. It was in the middle of the time when everything was changing. I mean, John Kennedy was killed, Martin Luther King was killed, Robert Kennedy was killed, all in the time that I was, 10, by the time I was 10 years old. Color TV was just coming in. It's really an odd time. We had party line phones, and we were moving from party line phones to you can get your own phone number. So it was a lot of change, both social change, economic change. Rights of women were being discussed more actively. Obviously, rights of blacks were being discussed and pushed more actively. So it was a time of turbulence, but a lot of opportunity, We were very poor. My mother was a single parent. We were very, very poor. And I mean, we weren't wearing rags in the street, but we were struggling to, keep the place that we lived, and my mother was struggling to feed us properly and make sure that we got a good education. And, I realized that when I was about 16 years old, I realized that. But before that, it was fine with me. Everything was great. My mother was obviously struggling, but she didn't really impart all of that uncertainty to us. So we actually had a pretty good childhood. It was just not one of a lot of material things. The projects then, which I think may be pretty much the way it is now. So I was born on 2nd Street and Avenue D, not in the projects, in what we called tenement housing. It's tenement housing. It's pretty famous. Whole museum about them now. Tenement housing. And when I was about 7 or 8, maybe 9, we moved from tenement housing to the projects. And this was an amazing step up. Tenement housings are very old, very like railroad apartments. So you enter the kitchen and then you walk through, you go to off the hallway is the bathroom, the next room is the living room, walk through the living room to the bedroom, walk through that bedroom to the next. So it's not like it is now. You literally have to walk through rooms to get to the next room. We lived there for a while. It was entirely too small. It was definitely unsafe. The buildings were very old and needed repair. And when we got accepted into, because you applied to go to the projects, when we got accepted to go into the projects, it was like, I don't know if you know the show The Jeffersons, Moving On Up. We were moving on up from the really bad to the bad. When we moved into the projects, we had a little bit bigger house, a little bit bigger apartment, but it was really difficult because these buildings were built many years before, so maybe 15 years before, and hundreds of people lived in them. Elevators were always broken down, always broken down. People slept in the stairwells. People used the bathroom in the stairwells. It was really, we used to have burn incinerators where you would bring your stuff and throw them in and they would burn it. And then after a while they had to stop that because people threw everything down these incinerators and obviously you couldn't burn everything. So it was a place of just physical disrepair and relatively unsafe because you had these very tall buildings, they were a way to keep people in. And that means good people and bad people. So, so drugs, it was almost like living in an encampment. So drugs were rampant, gangs were really big when I was growing up. Not as bad as now, like the Crips and the Bloods and these guys, but they were like the start of street gangs with guns and knives and this kind of stuff. If you stayed away from them, you were safe. But it was a place where you needed to get through to get to a safe house, which our place was a safe place. Great place. I mean, nicely kept. My mother was phenomenal. She was a great cook. It was always clean. We had order. But to get there, you had to kind of walk through all of this stuff and get there. And we learned how to obviously navigate it very well. And so it's physically not the place that, if you went there today, I think it may be a little bit different. But if you went there when I was growing up, this would not be a place that you wanted to hang out at all. You you would walk in as a white man and people would say, "Ooh, yeah, he's a good mark, a good mark for something." So it was not safe. It was not a safe place, not a clean place. Didn't smell very good.
Was it a family? Was it like a big community in some sense?
In this crazy place where when you describe it, it's actually worse than when you lived in it. Because when you lived in it, you just lived in it. You didn't sit back and say, "Oh my goodness, I'm walking past." You just lived in it and you figured out your way, you know. You made do with what you had. One of the famous sayings of one of my mentors, you make do with what you had. And so we were not afraid. You know, obviously there were scary situations all the time. You know, if you heard bullets or if you saw a fight, you just didn't get into it. You just moved past it or, you know, got inside and got safe. We didn't play wildly in the streets. It was nothing like that for our family. And by the way, there was a sense of community and family with close friends of ours. We lived in a bad place, but we were not bad people. So this was just, you know, regular Joes, like, you know, who lived with the picket fences. We just didn't have a picket fence. But we had best friends who had mothers and fathers in the building. Some people who had only fathers and mothers. But these were strong. Very many of the people who lived in the neighborhood that I lived in and who associated with us, you know, who my mother knew, were just regular strong families. We just happened to have not as much economic means as others, but this was not like, you know, we were sent to run in the, you know, the abandoned lot or to play in the car, nothing like that. We had a regular, pretty standard family, you know, orders, rules, you had to do schoolwork, you had chores, regular stuff like that. You didn't, even in the suburbs, you just didn't go out and, you know, run off you had to stay close to your family. So we didn't have, it wasn't, I think a lot of people actually think about the physical place and transpose that physical place to the people and say, well, this is a crime-ridden, disorderly, disorganized place, and so these people must be that. Not at all. Not at all. I mean, most of the people who we knew were just trying hard to make a better life. And we had fun, we went places. It was regular life. It wasn't that complicated.
And tell me about your parents.
My mother and my father was my mother. And we had a normal set of aunts and uncles, cousins, who lived not in our neighborhood but around. And most of them lived in the better parts of town in Queens, which was like the country back then, and in Brooklyn. My mother was my entire parent, you know, my whole parent structure. And she was very focused not on my father, because I learned when I was a little bit older, when I was about 16, that he was still alive. I mean, I knew he was alive, but I meant that I knew that he was around, and that he knew who we were, and that he knew he had sisters and brothers who kept an eye on us. Kept an eye on us is a strong word, but knew what we were doing. And so knew, you know, and he lived out in California. When I was 16 years old, he called, my brother was 18, he called our house to speak to my brother for his 18th birthday. I actually happened to answer the phone, and that was the first time I ever spoke to him. And at that time, when I was 16 years old, I was obviously more lucid and logical and, you know, more reasonable, more adult. And he spoke to my brother, and my mother and I and my brother spoke about this, about what we would do with this call, you know, after the call. Because after the call, he wanted to meet us. And my mother was very clear and very dispassionate. Her statement was that he's your father, and if you want to meet him, you should. And it really doesn't do anything to her or to our relationship. She didn't say him in those words, but it was to calm us and make sure that we knew that this was not something that she would object to. We ended up meeting him, not that day, but, you know, following that day, and he ended up not surprising us in any way. That's the best way to put it, to be kind. So when I was 16 on, I kind of knew this guy was around and had his phone number. He was living in California. Had his phone number. We could actually reach out to him, and we tried to on a couple of occasions. My brother tried more than I did. And it was never a sustainable or sustaining intervention, so we just didn't pursue it. And I really didn't have a huge desire at all. It was, people actually can't believe this. I had no desire really to get to know this guy. I had no real interest in that. And that's not as much about him as it is about me and the relationship that I had with my mother and how complete of a parent my mother was and how non-judgmental she was about this whole thing. And even though she had lots of reasons to not be pleasant about it, she was not at all unpleasant. She was, obviously, it was emotionally impactful, and as you get older, you realize how much struggle. It was a tremendous struggle. So, you know, when I was 16, I was more aware of how easy our life was and how difficult it was for her to make our life easy. And of course, as I knew that more, I became less and less interested in knowing this man, because I just realized how much effort she had put in us and how much energy, even though it seemed as though it was not hard, it was hugely hard for her. And so I just, you know, I continued. My mother was, for me and my sister and my brother, extremely impactful. Most parents are. So this, but my mother was, I think, maybe a little different than most. She just didn't, she was so uninterested in herself. At least that's the way it seemed to us. She was so interested in us, in how we were doing and how we were going to do, and lessons, but they weren't like, let's sit down and have a lesson. This was like life lessons. So she was very good. She was very good, very balanced. In hindsight, you know that when you're with her, it's like, who the heck is this? You know, when I was growing up, she was a regular parent. She was a parent like I am. You know, she was a pain in the rear end. She got in all your business. You know, all of the stuff that my kids now say I do. Yeah, she was regular, and so you know now she seems like whenever I talk about her, it's like a saint. But she wasn't. She was just a regular woman walking down the street. But she knew that the biggest impact that she could have on the world was to create 3 people who had good impact in the world. So that was her focus.
Tell me more about her. Where is she from?
She was born and raised in Panama. She came to the United States with my father when she was 25 years old, and about 25 years old. And my father served in the Army. Panama was a U.S. protectorate. They came from the Canal Zone, so it was actually probably U.S. property at that time. Or I'm not sure the status, but he could come to the United States people from Panama, men, could come to the United States if they joined and fought in some war for us, which I thought was an interesting way to get us here. And so he did, and he and she came, and she was a high school graduate. She didn't finish college. My mother had an amazing way of saying things that obviously she didn't know that they would be repeated on TV, or she would have used better grammar and probably wouldn't have cursed as much as she did. But she was pretty frank. I'm very frank as well. She was very frank, and she was forceful in the way that she spoke. And she would yell, obviously, and she would do all of the normal things that a parent does. But she would say things. She would try to tell us, and most of these sayings that she had came out when she was trying to teach us how to live, which was every day. But then, you know, obviously she's trying to teach you how to live every day. But there were examples of important moments where she would make statements. One of her famous things that she said over and over and over again to me, and to my brother and my sister. But when I was thinking of applying to colleges, I applied to all these like really wild-ass colleges. I mean, they were crazy colleges. You know, I said, oh, I'm going to apply to Columbia. I'm going to apply to Yale. I'm going to apply to Polytechnic Institute in New York. I'm going to apply to all these colleges. And you know, I looked in these books and realized that they were all highly competitive, like the most competitive colleges, and they all cost a lot of money. And then I had second thoughts, and I said to my mother one day, you know, I think I messed up because I'm actually applying to all these colleges. It's very unlikely. What happens if I don't get in? And my mother said to me, all you have to worry about is one acceptance. That's all. They have to make one acceptance in your favor. Everybody else is not of interest to you. So you have to position yourself well with that one acceptance, for that one acceptance. So you have to write essays very much like today, fill out the application. And all through this process, she said to me, just make sure that you worry about it's not about anybody else. It's all about your one acceptance. Another time she would always tell me, I said, what happens if this happens to me? She says, Max, my middle name is Maxine, and my family call me Max or Maxine. She said to me, Maxine or Max, things happen to you, you have to worry, but make sure that you happen to things, right? And it was, as she said this all the time, this is not about being a victim or sitting back and worrying about things happening to you. Take the initiative and make sure that you can head things off, and so that you happen to things. And make sure when you happen to things, or things or people, etc., that you happen to them in a positive way. And it was, obviously when she said these things, I would roll my eyes and go, yeah, another. But as you get older, you realize these are very important lessons. You could sit back and let a whole bunch of stuff happen to you, but you can also head things off and take initiative and make sure that you have some say in the kind of things that become a part of your reality and an important part of your life. And she was really, really into that, about us having control, and us, my brother, my sister, and I, making sure that we knew how good we were. And this wasn't, today I think we've actually gotten crazy on this. Like, every kid has to win everything. That wasn't it at all. Every kid has to go to the most amazing school and get, it wasn't any of that. It was about assuring that you had the right temperament and approach to life, so that she would always say to me, you must leave behind more than you take in any situation. Leave behind more than you take. And if you can do that, it'll add up to a good life over time. But if you continually go into places and remove stuff and leave voids, then your life will not be successful. You will not be a good person. And that was another one that comes back comes back often when I think about just any situation. Just make sure that you kind of try to leave not a trail of dead bodies, a trail of live, enthusiastic people.
What was your favourite thing to do with her? What's your best memory of that?
My mother was a serial bargain hunter. We didn't have a lot of money, so she would go to like flea markets and stuff like that. And so walking, I remember the trains and the buses cost like 10 cents or 5 cents. So whatever it was like either 5 or 10, or went from 5 to 10 when I was growing up, and then it went to 20, and now it's $2.20. It's amazing. But we would have to walk to most places, and our world was obviously very small. I lived on 3rd Street and Avenue D or Delancey Street, and I think we could walk as far as 14th Street, which is where Mays and Gimbel's. And I remember I hated shopping with her, I hated it. But I loved walking to the places with her, and so that's what we would do. We would walk. When I was younger, 5 or 6 or 7, my mother was a daycare worker, so kids would be delivered to our house. And she was certified as a daycare worker, and these are middle-class families' kids who needed after school or before school care, or they were young enough to stay in the house all day. And she got paid per child by the state. It was good, but it wasn't enough money to really make do. So she would always clean offices. So we got our dental care by cleaning the dentist's office, and we got our medical care by cleaning the doctor, Dr. Gerstein. I remember his name. I don't remember the dentist's name, by cleaning Dr. Gerstein's office. And when we went in there, we had to sit, because she had nobody take care of us when she was cleaning she took care of other people's kids, and then after they left, she would go clean the office. We would have to go with her and sit in the offices, and we could not move. My brother, my sister, and I would have to sit there, and she would be doing her thing, and we'd be she'd be yelling at us to stay still and sit down, and that was a good set of memories. It was really interesting how torturous it was. It was probably for an hour, right? But it seemed like it was for all day. We were in this damn place, sitting quietly in these chairs because we couldn't mess anything up, and those are the kind of things that come to mind.
You talked about going to college. Was that a big decision for you? Was that something that was part of your background?
Yeah, going to college for my brother and my sister and I, for our family, was not a big decision at all. It was not optional. It was a normal part of our conversation in our house. It was this, so you're going to go to high school and you're going to go to college, and what are you going to do when you finish college? It was that type of discussion, very, very standard. Little did I know that, and now I know it because I had to do it with my kids, that there are other things you should contemplate when you're trying to figure out what college you're going to go to, like how far it is away from home, whether you can pay for it. This is a kind of a real thing, right? We never had a conversation about whether you could pay for it. Never. Fortunately not. because it would have, I think, clearly limited my choices. I don't know what my mother was thinking. My mother was thinking that we would get a scholarship. I don't know, because we never had conversations like, you're going to get a scholarship or you have to get a scholarship to go to this college. It was just, you do well in school, grade school, high school, and then you go to college. So that's what we did. We did well. I went to college, and I applied, and fortunately, someone paid for it, but we never really talked about it at all. And I got into a number of colleges, and I chose Brooklyn Polytechnic. It was called Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute at the time. Now it's called Polytechnic Institute of NYU. It's part of NYU. It's a total engineering college, engineering and science college. They obviously taught English and stuff like that, but this was not what you went to that school for. You went to school to study math, to study the sciences, to study engineering. And I got into the school on what they call a Higher Education Opportunity Program Scholarship. And it's called HEOP, and HEOP is it's a program that I think it still runs, that is for people who are not ready to go to college. So you go to college. I went the first year of Poly, and I did well on the SATs, and I had taken like a pre-calculus class, and I had taken a chemistry class, and a biology class, and a physics class in high school. But these were like what my kids take in freshman year, really, or ninth grade, 8th grade. I mean, it was to that level of intensity and depth. So when I walked into Poly, they test you before you come in the HEOP program. We had to go to school in the summer in HEOP program. When I came in, I was definitely well behind the students there. Most of the students came from Bronx Science or Stuyvesant, went to my school, which are the two premier science high schools in New York City, and probably in the United States. So here I come from Cathedral High School, which is an all-girl Catholic school who had some classes occasionally in sciences, and I was definitely well behind. I remember coming into college, and the guys had in their pockets slide rules and mechanical pencils. I always remember this. And one of the first things that I got as a gift for a summer program, because I would always talk about these slide rules, was the slide rule. And I could only use it for like a day or two because the TI calculator came out after that. They'd only added, the four-function calculator came out. And it took me years to get that. I couldn't get a TI calculator for a while. But anyway, when I went to college, it was clear I was clearly behind. And this program had a lot of support for students that were behind, and they gave you a stipend. And you had to work, you do some work with, tutor somebody or whatever. But I quickly caught up. And after the first semester of college, I did great in the first semester. I had totally caught up, and I was now a tutor. I was like a very high-level tutor for other HEOP kids, but for other kids in general. I worked really hard in college. I was a very good student, and being behind helped me to gain a place. It was interesting. Having a deficiency by the standards of the educational structure there helped me gain a unique position, because I was this like wonder kid. Oh my goodness, this person came in and couldn't read, and now she can read. Obviously I could read. But it was one of those things, so I was paraded out often and picked out often. It was good.
Is this where you found your voice?
I found my voice. I became aware of the fact that I had some special things when I was in high school. I went to an all-girl Catholic high school, and it was a great place to go to school. So we didn't have the worry of boys running around the halls. And dressing for them. We wore uniforms. So we had my high school is still there. I actually just went back to it not too long ago. It's a great place because you can focus on, in your free time, instead of focusing on the boys in the hallway. Obviously we'd focus on other things, but I'm going to use that as an analogy. We focused on issues. We would talk about all kinds of things. I remember we had a project to try to figure out, this is 72 to 76, the national budget. And we had to make a recommendation for how we would redo the budget of the United States of America. And at that time, who the heck knew? All we knew I didn't even know how much it was until they gave us, we did research and so on. And it was obviously huge. It was more money than you could imagine. And I remember I had a little team. It was three of us doing this work. They were all groups of three. And we decided that we were going to take 50% of the money away from defense because it was the biggest portion of the budget. And I remember the nun asking me, we were taught by nuns, why did we do that? And I said, well, because it was so big, we would cut it in half. And she said, well, it may be big because you needed it, because we need it. And so we should do some research on what does it do exactly. And so we had this kind of work to do. It was a great school. And so it actually compelled us to stand up. And, it wasn't wild, marches or anything like that, but it was more about just thinking. It was a thinking school. It was a thinking school, not a rote school. And it was great. And so we learned how to read. We learned how to read critically, how to write very well, how to analyze, how to do basic functions, like math, how to structure a sentence. And we didn't get into all of this other fancy stuff. It was before computers. It was before sports. We didn't have sports. We had to play. We had gym, and it was in the back. It was a concrete place behind the school. We played dodgeball like for 50. I mean, it was nothing like it is today. It was very school-based. It was basic education. That was where I first learned, because I had a lot of supporting girlfriends. It was all of us were girls. That's where I learned to kind of rise up. And then when I went to college, I learned to rise up because I was smart. I was smarter than people thought I was. I don't know how smart I was purely, but people actually thought I couldn't do it. So I was smarter than they thought I was. So I had a voice, therefore, because people were surprised. And I learned from my mother that if you have a chance to speak, you should speak. If you have an opinion, you should make it be known. My mother would always say to me that I was wrong and strong 90% of the time, meaning that I was totally off base, but I did it with forcefulness, right? He says, you're wrong and strong. And I should watch out for that. So I did, as I got older and older, I watched out for being wrong and strong. You want to be right and strong. And so anyway, it was a good time. I learned my voice throughout my life. And there's a point where you can't go back. This is all you know. I don't know when that was, but this is all I know. This idea of having less to lose than to gain in an attempt. And so I really did. I tried a lot of things. There's a lot of things. Traveled a lot. As soon as I had a chance to travel, most of it for work, I was all for it. If somebody said, do this job, I would say, yeah, sure, why not, why not try it? More the gain than there is to lose in most endeavors, I think. And so I learned that from my mother.
And why business? Why did you choose to head towards business?
Well, I actually didn't make a choice. I didn't say, I think, nowadays, this is what they do. These kids actually come in and they say, well, I'm going to do this for a little while and then choose. When I came into work at Xerox, I just chose to work. So they said, how about this? And I said, okay, well, I'll go do that in the lab. And how about this? I go do that. And then somebody said to me, well, how about this? How about doing some business planning, pricing? And I said, yeah, sure, why not? So I didn't there was not like a conscious choice. I said, I think I should now move from this to that. It was, at Xerox, we call it the true diversity, opportunity and hard work, right? So I had just a lot of opportunities to do all kinds of things. Some of those had to do with business. Some of those had to do with on the technical side. And I tried both. I did some of them both together. When I was managing an engineering program, you had to kind of do both things together. So I never made a conscious choice. I said, I'm going to flip from here to there. There was a point that my acumen started leaning more towards larger global systems problems in the company. And systems problem is the business. It's how do you take the customer, the environment, the technology you have, the internal, and how do you put that together in a solution that's better, the best for your shareholders and for your employees and for your customers. That's a systems problem. So in systems problems, I like those types of challenges, complex challenges. So that's the business, and so you get to go to that end, because that was where I excelled, I guess.
It seemed like you had a big break. There's this thing on work-life balance. There's a meeting on diversity, and you're there with Wayland Hicks. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I had a couple of defining moments in my career that people would call big breaks. I call them a little bit more defining moments. The first one was my first job, and that was when I was given a lab, and a guy who worked for me, his name was Dick Schick. He was a phenomenal lab technician. He's one of these, he was older than I was, more experienced than I was, and he was a tech, so that means he was a specialist in making things work, design, I would design an experiment and he would have to kind of figure out a way to build it. Having somebody work for me, this guy was smarter than I could ever be about what he did, and I remember walking into work thinking, I remember I'm a highfalutin engineer, and I have a lab, and Dick Schick taught me more about life, make sure you understand what you really know and how really things get done. That was one big moment for me. The second defining moment was when I met this is the time that I had met my husband. He wasn't my husband then, obviously. He wasn't even my boyfriend then. We weren't dating. I was walking up and down the halls, and I worked in a research lab, and in order to get to the cafeteria, you had to walk past all these offices, all these labs and offices. I did this for like 2 years, up and down the hall. One day, this guy walks out and says, you walk up and down the halls all the time, and you never stop and engage with them, the rest of the people. And so that's when I met my husband. He said, kind of step out. There's other stuff that's happening. And he's the one who said, there's going to be a quality of QWLC, Quality of Work-Life Council meeting coming up. Why don't you come to this meeting? And I had the same kind of approach to these kinds of things I have now. Quality of work-life. I mean, you got to be joking me. What is this going to be, like a prayer meeting or kumbaya session? And anyway, I went with him. I thought he was kind of cute, so I actually went with him because I was flirting a little bit. And at that meeting, there was a man, his name was Wayland Hicks, who ran all of the internal functions of the company, basically development, manufacturing, those kinds of functions. And he was doing a roundtable, a big quality of work-life session where he was kind of listening to employees, and they were telling them how they felt, their gripes, what was making them happy, and he was then responding, and somebody was taking notes, etc. We were trying to figure out a way to, they were trying to figure out a way to get workers together to make this cafeteria better or whatever. And one of the people who raised their hands asked a question about quote unquote, bringing in all of these women and minorities to the workplace. And that since these women and minorities didn't have as good an education or a good background as the non-women and minorities, what did he think about the fact that it was lowering the performance and the standards and the performance of the company? So it was kind of not a very good question to ask for women and minorities in the room, but this person obviously didn't seem to care a whole lot. Wayland Hicks actually answered the question in a very nonchalant way. Good answer. And I was almost as insulted with him answering the question the way that he answered it as with the person who asked the question. So I saw, I went up to Wayland, or maybe in the meeting spoke up and said, it was in the meeting, I spoke up and said, I'm actually surprised that you answered the question. It is, I'm actually astonished that you would give it any time of day. And, so on, so on, so on. We went back and forth for a little while. Meeting is over. My husband, wasn't husband then, as I said, came up to me and said, did you know who that guy was that you were all over in the meeting? I was all over him. And I said, no. He said, well, his name is Wayland Hicks, and he runs the place. And I said, well, the worst that can happen is I have to look for another job. And so, I didn't think a whole lot about it. I did worry a little bit about it, but didn't think a whole lot about it. The next day, Wayland Hicks had his admin called me, found out who I was, and had his admin call me to come to his office. I had to come to his office, not that day, but Friday. Let's say this is Wednesday. And so now I have from Wednesday to Friday to sweat about being fired on Friday. Friday came, and I walked into his office, and Wayland had this big stand-up desk. And he did all his work standing up, and he had on his wall a big poster because we were being attacked by competitors at this time, some of the Japanese competitors. And he had a big saying, a very aggressive saying on the wall. I remember walking in here going, oh, this is going to be really a great meeting. And it was a great meeting. He said, I've been thinking about what you said, and you were right that I could have approached this answer differently to make it clearer that the question was inappropriate. But the way that you approached this was probably not the best way to approach it. And from there, from there we had a back and forth, and we had a back and forth that lasts till this day. Wayland is still a very good friend of mine personally, and a friend of my family's as well. And this was a very big moment, not because of that alone, but because through this time, so I got to know Wayland. He asked me to be his executive assistant a couple of years later, like 8 years later or 7 years later. He always was kind of around. He asked me to be his executive assistant, and when I was his executive assistant, I got to know Wayland. Paul Allaire, who was the chairman. Paul asked me to be his executive assistant, and that I got placed on a task force to help redesign the company. I got a job out of it. I mean, so that was, this whole encounter with Wayland was the start of a lot of things that came. But the other thing, it was not only that encounter. Wayland and I are like black and white. We are like night and day. We have very little in common. This is a middle American, conservative Republican guy, and I am a urban, New York City, liberal as the day comes, democratic as the day comes person, black. Very clear set of beliefs about what's good and what's bad and so on, and so is he. And it was interesting that I could form a friendship with somebody who was so different. We argued about everything, about war, about civil, you name it, we argued about it. You know, obviously this man has a good heart, and it was not, you know, we just have different opinions. So it was a good defining, teachable moment for me that you could actually like, respect, more than just work with, somebody who was so different in just about every way that you can imagine, but a lot of commonality. So it was a defining moment, not only in work, it was also a defining moment personally for me.
When did you think you had it in you to get to the top?
For the first 20 years of my career, I actually didn't even think about it. It wasn't even a thought. I think in the first 10 years, I didn't even know that there was a CEO in the company. I mean, we just came in and we came to work. CEO was so far away. It's very different than it is today when we're all over TV, and you can Google us, and you know they write everything about us. It wasn't like that then. So I had 2 levels up or 3 levels up of a boss was like God to us. We didn't have these CEO guys running all over the place, or girls running all over the place. After I got to be more senior, when I became like a chief engineer, when I managed a big product program, I realized that the levels obviously got higher, and I realized that there was a CEO. But even then, I had very little interest in that life. I was really interested in the job I was doing and the next couple of jobs. After I got into expanding out of engineering and got into pricing and had to do more and more presentations about business value and these types of things, that's when I realized there was a CEO. But even then I said, odds are, I didn't even think about it that way. It was just, they're there, and I'm here. During this transition when I was working for Paul, when he was the CEO, when I was working for Wayland, and then when I was working for Paul, I realized what they did, what these executives did. I remember saying to Wayland one day, we were flying home from some god-awful trip, which we did a lot of, on a commercial airline in coach. And we were talking about a guy, and I said, I can do this guy's job with my eyes closed. And I make a quarter of what he makes. You should just give me the job. And it was one of my smart aleck remarks about something. And I wasn't trying to be smart aleck, it just came out that way. He said, no, you don't have credibility. So you have the know-how and so on, but you have to have credibility. You have to have people follow you. You have to be able to create followership, and you couldn't do that quite yet. That was when I started to realize that during that time frame, that the difference between me and them, whoever they are, were not that big. Not that I was like super smart or anything, but that they were just human beings. They just, with a lot of experience, who had good outcomes throughout their career. I mean, they did their job well. And then, when I started working for Paul, I met for the first time formally Vernon Jordan, who was on our board. And I got to fly with him our CEO and some other board members on a plane going to a board meeting in Brussels. And on this, so Vern and I had a conversation on this plane. It was a pretty standard conversation. I was totally and completely intimidated. It was amazing. Because I kind of knew who this guy was, because he's pretty famous. He was famous back then. He's still famous now, but famous back then. He's a black civil rights leader. This guy, it was pretty impressive. He's a huge guy. And he was talking to me, and he gave me a reading assignment. And he wrote me a letter afterwards and asked if I had done my reading assignment. And we started to converse whenever I would go to board meetings or have to be around the board when there was a board meeting. And he reinforced something that I kind of thought, which was that I was pretty good. And that, yeah, he never said you can be the CEO. He said, yeah, just you're pretty good. And it was always like a positive word, a positive glimmer. And then about 5 years into that, I realized, yeah, I have time, because CEO is about accomplishment. You got to do the work. It's a lot about timing. I mean, the timing has to be right. If you're the wrong timing, your age, the current CEO's age, what opens up, it's about things that you can contribute to, and then a whole bunch of other things that you have no timing, luck, whatever the heck it is. So I kind of realized I had the capacity about 10 years ago, and I realized that I had the possibilities about 8 years ago, and then of course, so it worked out well. It worked out well from a CEO perspective. It could have just as easily been that I was a senior executive in the company and happy as well. So another senior executive in the company happy as well.
And when it finally happened, what did it mean to you?
It was amazing. This is the most amazing thing. First of all, when I was told formally that I became CEO, I couldn't believe, it's amazing, because I kind of knew, by this time I kind of knew, right? 6 months before I knew kind of that it was going to happen. It still had to be voted on by the board, but, and it could have screwed up. But the only thing that really could have screwed it up is I blew up a plant or something, right? Or, did something really stupid. So it was kind of a glide path to that, and a lot of learning I had to do. But the day that it was announced, I remember saying, I cannot believe this. This is the best goddamn thing in the world. Because it was perfect in that I had worked, my only job was at Xerox Corporation. I knew so much about this place. Not about the running of it, but this was part of my 30 years, I was alive 50 years. 30 years of it was in this place. So I spent more time in this place than I did with my mother. Because really, my mother died when I was 25. Think about this. So, and to now be told that all that time culminated in you being given the honor to run it. To lead it. I was flabbergasted. One of the first things I did was call my house after you get out of the board meeting, etc. And I called my house. My daughter answered the phone, and I said, "Melissa, you'll never believe it. I was made CEO today." She said, "Yeah, right." She said, "Yeah." She didn't say, "Yeah, right." She said, "Yeah. You want to talk to Dad?" And so she literally hands the phone over to my husband, and I said, "I was made CEO today." Of course, he was a lot more excited about it, etc. And right at that time, there was a huge amount of flurry. This was amazing, because so they announced this in the board. Then we publicly announced it on the wire services, and they start calling. The newspapers, you name it, starts calling, because it turns out there was a huge uproar, positive uproar, about two things. One we kind of expected, but I didn't think it was as big a deal, and the other one literally caught me by surprise. One was the first black female CEO. See, I kind of expected that coming, but I thought it would kind of blow over relatively quickly. It didn't. And the second was the first female-to-female CEO handoff. And I never thought about that. I said, yeah, I guess that's true, right? The newspapers called my house, and we had warned my kids to, if anybody calls, just hand the phone over, etc. The New York Daily News called my house. My daughter answered the phone, and they asked her a whole bunch of questions, and she was, she obviously forgot the don't speak to the reporter thing, and she answered them all well, which was really, really proud of my mother. She'll be a great leader, all of the stuff like that. So it was really good. But yeah, there was a lot of uproar, and to an extent that positive uproar still holds, because both of these things are still true. First female to female, and the first African American or a black female CEO. But they won't be true for long, I'm sure. I mean, we're moving down this path of significantly more diversity, which is good. And so hopefully there will be another female-to-female handoff, and there'll be another black female CEO.
Why is it taking so long? I mean, you know, you talked about your childhood.
It's all about pipeline. It's taking long because it's about pipeline. It does take experiences and time to become the CEO of a company. It does take it. Unfortunately, you have to become relevant in the company that you're in, relevant in the work that they do, in the culture that they have, in the strategy. You know, you have to become relevant. You can't do that by just kind of waking up one day. And the issue is not what we're doing today as much as what we did 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So I think this is all about time and timing. So there are other things to do, but in today, so 5 years from now, we'll see even more female CEOs. Because 10 years ago, people started to think about this even more than they did 20 years ago, and they did 30 years ago. So the women are getting more experiences that make it possible for them to be considered naturally versus this, oh my God, we got to get a woman, just naturally. And we are performing at all levels in the company well enough to be considered. So I think that's, in the immediate next couple of years, it's all about getting these people through. There are other things we have to do to make sure that the pipeline continues. I mean, you know, this pipeline thing, for women in particular, but it's for any underrepresented minority, is a challenge because we get people in early. If they can live through year 7 to year 17, we got it. But we seem to lose them in this kind of, there's a time when, I'm not talking about Xerox. Xerox actually keeps a lot of their women, but there's this time in life, like the 7-year itch, that things happen and women, particularly in women, opt out is for many, many, many different reasons. A lot of them, some of them are, you know, social reasons. Some of them are physiological reasons. They want to have children, you know. But a lot of them are unfriendly, unyielding environmental reasons that we have to figure out a way to recognize that there are differences and different needs because there are things that only women can do. And we have to figure out a structure that's a little bit more acceptable and accepting of that. And it's not as easy to do as it sounds.
And how did you balance work and home life?
So how did I balance it? I didn't balance it very well. See, I actually kept redefining what balance meant. I decided that I was failing so miserably at any previous definition that I was going to redefine it. My definition is over your life. Over your life, do you have a balance of work and family, work and outside work life? In any period of time, in a year, in any period of time, I fail any of them, you know, either of them, for sure. So when my kids were very, very young, when my daughter and son were very, very young, I failed the family work-life balance because I spent a little bit more time with my family. So I didn't balance it very well. And when my kids got in like 7, 8, 9, I failed the balance in family because I was all over the place, traveling all over the world. Then when they got a little bit older, so it comes and it goes, and it's nothing as graceful as it sounds. It's not it's never balanced at a specific time. If it is, I feel unsettled because I'm missing something on one side or the other. So,
what's the most meaningful piece of advice you've received?
Most meaningful piece of advice I've received is to work hard.
And what's the one piece of advice you'd give a woman on either building a career, pursuing their dreams, their work-life balance, or raising a family?
So my advice to young women, by the way, young men as well, but young women, think about your future. Make sure you have a reasonably good idea of what you want it to look like. And most people think about their future from a work perspective only. I say look at the whole story. Make sure you kind of understand, you can envision the life that you want to lead and live. And find something to do that you love. If you don't love it, just find something else to do.
When you were younger, what did you want to be?
A mathematician or a scientist. I never thought about engineers. I didn't know what they were. But I knew that I was pretty good at this kind of stuff. And so I didn't know what they got paid or anything. I wanted to be a mathematician or a scientist.
And what are you most proud of?
My kids. I'm most proud of my kids. My husband and I I love and my husband, but I didn't have a lot to do with his upbringing. But my husband and I really are trying to raise contributors to the world. I hope like heck. I mean, we still have time for both of them to not do this, but I think we're pretty far along the way that these kids are bright, socially aware, global, not timid people.
And your first paying job?
First paying job was working at Woolworths. Woolworth being a cashier. Yeah.
What 3 adjectives best describe you?
Fearless, passionate, and fast.
And the person you've never met who's had the biggest influence on your life?
Albert Einstein and Martin Luther King. Albert Einstein, because he was just amazingly witty and smart. You know, he was just this wild guy who thought of stuff. He had there was not a boundary. He said, yeah, I know that you told me that it doesn't work, and totally irrelevant. I'm going to figure it out. And then he had a whole bunch of fun. He was like a crazy guy. I love him. Whenever I read about him, I love him. And Martin Luther King, because he was fearless in another way. I mean, this guy, if you think about what he did when he did it, it would have been best to shut up and just stay home. He didn't. He just decided that, yeah, I'm not shutting up and I'm not staying home.
And do you consider yourself a feminist?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I'm a feminist. What do I mean by that? I think that there are a lot of bad words that are, bad images that are associated with feminism. But here's my thing about feminism. I think women are different than men. And that's a good thing. And by the way, it's a good thing for the world. It's a good thing for men. It's a damn good thing for women. And the differences between women and men should be celebrated. They are not pointed out. They're just celebrated. By the way, the differences between men and women should be celebrated by men. That's good. They can play football better than women can play football, or whatever the hell it is. So I'm a feminist in the purest sense. I don't think that there should be equality of things that we do. You know, I don't think that women should play men's basketball. I just don't think I like men's basketball with men playing it. I think women should have their distinct value-added place in the world that they define, that nobody else defines, that they define. So yeah, I'm a big feminist.
Then lightning round, iPad or notepad?
iPad.
Early bird or night owl?
Both. Early bird and night owl, unfortunately.
Spontaneous or methodical?
Methodical.
Type A or easygoing?
Type A.
Diplomatic or direct?
Direct.
Higher math score or higher verbal?
Math.
Patient or impatient?
Absolutely impatient.
Prada or Gap?
Gap.
Prepare or cram?
Prepare and cram.
Domestically skilled or domestically challenged?
Domestically skilled, absolutely.
10 minutes early or 10 minutes late?
Definitely not 10 minutes early. Never 10 minutes late.
Book smart or street smart?
Book smart and street smart. No doubt about it.